of marriages and a dynastic inheritance. He was king of Spain. He controlled the kingdom of Naples, the Duchy of Milan in Italy. He practically controlled the politics of the Pope because the Pope was surrounded by his territory. In Northern Europe, he controlled, or he was the head of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the equivalent of modern Germany. He controlled the Austrian land, the Kingdom of Hungary, which is east of there, and finally the very rich territories of the Netherlands. So you can see this is a very extensive territory. And so he was collecting taxes from all these places, more or less, and that was an important base of his support. Furthermore, he had the gold and silver from the New World, and he had at his disposition the modern Spanish army, and I explained that the Spanish army was the most powerful in Europe. So when you added up the combination of territory and resources, his dream of, in the first place, reviving the Roman Empire under him, and secondly, he wanted to protect the unity of the Catholic Church. The Roman Empire and the Catholic Church were his two main concerns. He had a lot behind him. However, he was blocked. What stood in his way? First of all, could you mute? First of all, the rise of the Ottomans, and he was fighting the Muslims, the Ottoman armies, and the Muslims in the Mediterranean throughout most of his reign, either directly or indirectly, draining away some of his strength. Then he was constantly fighting with the King of France, who was really the only major power standing against him. The King of France didn't want to be absorbed in this empire. And finally, the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation in Germany crippled his dream of both religious and political unity. So that's the answer to that review question. Okay, now I want to turn back to the narrative of the lectures. And we left off, I was dealing with Castiglione's courtier. And remember I explained that Machiavelli's Prince was certainly being read by a lot of people, but also the Castiglione's courtier was being read because it explained, by the way, Charles V himself was, he kept this volume by his bedside. He liked it so much that Charles V actually, it was one of his favorite books. Well, Castiglione was an Italian in the service of Charles V. And the reason for the popularity of the book was it brought humanism to the royal courts. That's where the nobles were congregated. They no longer enjoyed independence from the crown. The crown was too powerful. So for a nobleman to make a mark, he had to please the prince, he had to please the king. And the courtier basically explained how to do this. And it said that in the first place, these noblemen and noblewomen had to become gentle. That is to say, they had to become civilized. They had to pursue a humanist education. They had to learn to restrain their passions. They had to become polite. They had to become rational and just couldn't give up into their passions. Um, and uh, so the idea was this perfect gentleman and all around person to have as many attributes as possible, which could possibly pursue a king. And as I explained toward the end of last lecture, um, these qualities then were set off and contrasted with the uncivilized and uncouth behavior of the common people. The nobles were not really ruling them by force. No, the nobles were gentlemen and were going to lead the rest of society by setting a good example. Also, I said that this idea uh, of gentility and so on was also used as a justification for or civility um, for dominating non-European peoples. The non-European people were not only uh, not Christians and had to be converted, but they were also, from the point of view of these elite Europeans, irrational, ignorant, governed by their passions. They couldn't govern themselves, so the European elite was uh, basically installed in order to govern them. And I would note that here we see sort of an example of the mentality of Europeans in the form of a statue done by an Italian artist by the name of Lione of the Emperor Charles V. And the thing that is notable about this emperor is that he's dressed in Roman armor. You see him wear of a Roman emperor, the armor of a Roman emperor. And he's, of course, holding a spear, and he's looking downward. Please.
Excuse me. Hey, let me just say, no.
Could you mute, please? Anyway, he's standing over a chained slave who is either a indigenous person or a Black slave. And it symbolizes the mentality of the times, especially the elite mentality of the times in terms of what they were doing in the third world. This is done in the form of an allegory, but the actual meaning of it is quite clear. So I've discussed Taglioni, I've discussed Machiavelli, I've discussed Thomas More as examples of the variety of things that humanists were interested in. Now, I want to deal with one final humanist who, as I explained, was in his own ways as important as Machiavelli in terms of his historical significance. And this individual, his name is Erasmus. And Erasmus was a monk from the Netherlands, from Holland, really. And he proved to be a brilliant Latin and Greek scholar. I'm looking, there he is, right there. And he started out actually like very similar to these Italian humanists, like Machiavelli himself and these people up here, Bruni, Valla, Salutati, and so on. They were studying the writings of the ancient Greeks and the Romans, of the great pagan writers, non-Christian writers of the ancient world, studying their history, studying their poetry, studying their stories, studying their philosophy. Erasmus began basically as a student of these people. But he began to, over his career, he began to gradually change his orientation. One of the things he did was he complained about the wars that were raging all around Europe at this time. The wars, especially in Italy, but in fact, especially on the borders between Germany and France, and Spain, there were these terrible wars between the French king and the English kings were involved, and of course Charles V. And he declared himself in principle against war, declared himself to be a pacifist, anti-war, which was very unusual because the culture in Europe was dominated by feudalism, by landlords, by a warrior mentality, and he protested. He protested in the name of Christianity, which Christianity was supposed to stand against war, but also he reflected the point of view of the middle class. He himself came from the middle class, and the middle class, they may have been a bit ambivalent about it, but war was against their interests. War disturbed property and disrupted trade. So in a way, Erasmus's anti-war position reflected their position. Now, but his change of direction was in a way, even more significant in that he began to turn away from studying the pagan classics, Cicero, Sallust, Livy, and so on. And he began to say that it's all very good, and the study of these classical pagan writers is all very good and so on, but we're Christians. So instead of concentrating on the pagan authors, why don't we begin to look seriously at the documents of early Christianity? I mean, the Italian humanists are looking at the documents of the pagan world, the Greeks and the Romans. So let's turn away from that. Let's look at the early documents of our religion. Why don't we study the Bible? Why don't we study the New Testament? Why don't we study the writings of what we call the fathers of the church? People like Augustine and Jerome, the early fathers who commented on the Bible, explained what the Bible was all about, or elaborated on the teachings of the Bible, these fathers of the church, so-called. Why don't we begin to study them? Because the Italian humanists have perfected the methodologies of studying the documents of the past. So we can apply these methods to actually understanding the Bible, the New Testament, and the early fathers better if we use these methods to investigate these early documents. And so he began a long period of study in which he was basically trying to produce a new printed version of the New Testament, which would be both in Latin and Greek, and which would be the best edition of the New Testament yet produced, because it was based on a study of using these methods and using many manuscripts. And they would be compared, and the best wordings would be found for this definitive text of the New Testament. Along the way, he began to write about religious and church matters. He began to produce pamphlets and little books, which were sort of the outcome of his study. And what emerged from these books and treatises and pamphlets was a growing criticism of the state of the existing church. He said that the contemporary Catholic Church was corrupt. It was too much concerned with property, with money, with empty rituals and superstitions. And that rather than being concerned about these things, it should be, and based on his study of the New Testament, he decided that, as a matter of fact, early Christianity wasn't about any of these things, money or property or rituals or superstitions. It was based on a simple morality, which he called the philosophy of Christ. And basically what this was all about was simply the Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Be a good person. Be a simple, good Christian person. Do simple, good works of charity. And God will be pleased with you, and you will go to heaven. As a matter of fact, this is worth doing in any case. And remember, this is a time when the printed book is becoming popular. And these ideas began to become more and more popular. More and more people were reading Erasmus and were saying, you know, he's right. The church is corrupt, needs to be reformed. And the true way is simply following Jesus Christ and the so-called philosophy of Christ. Now, Erasmus was not, and these ideas began to spread, in other words. Now, Erasmus was not a revolutionary. He wanted a reform of the church. He wanted to make the existing, he wanted to preserve the unity and to reform the Catholic Church. And do you know that today's Catholic Church, although they ignored Erasmus or even condemned him while he was alive, basically his teaching is now the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church today. So he was not a revolutionary, but somebody who was paying close attention to what Erasmus was writing and who was very influenced by him was a revolutionary. And his name was Martin Luther. Martin Luther. And Martin Luther is the most important figure of what we call the Protestant Reformation, or the secession from the Catholic Church by the so-called Protestants. Now, Luther started out as an Orthodox Catholic. He was very religious. He became a monk, an Augustinian monk. And he went to study at a university in Germany called the University of Wittenberg, which was in Saxony, in the Dukedom of Saxony. That was his homeland. That was the part of Germany he came from Saxony. And he picked up and he sort of began to radicalize what Erasmus is talking about. In his sermons and writings, Luther began to criticize the power, the money, the wealth of the church, and also its rituals and what he considered to be its superstitious practices. Basically, he was saying that these had become a stumbling block to the actual salvation of people. They were getting the practices of the church were actually getting in the way of people's salvation. And so he gradually, in fact, by studying Erasmus's new edition of the Bible, he came to the conclusion that a lot of the beliefs in the Catholic Church were questionable in the sense that they were not biblical. They were not to be found in the Bible, and so they were inauthentic. For example, the Catholic Church had made marriage into one of the 7 sacraments. Well, Luther concluded that marriage, whatever it was certainly not a sacrament. Likewise, extreme unction, let's say kind of a ritual at the time of death, that was not in the early church, one of the practices of the early church. It had been added on by the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. And in particular, he criticized the idea that to enter the priesthood was also a sacrament. He said he came to the conclusion that there was nothing special about priests, that this was not biblical, the idea of a special priesthood. His overall conclusion was that Christianity should be strictly based on the Bible. Now, as a matter of fact, the Roman Catholic teachings were based on what the Pope said, what the fathers of the church said, what the councils of the church said. All of these went into constituting the theology of the Catholic Church, which had come into being over centuries, down to 1500, since antiquity. Luther said, none of this matters. It's only what is in the Bible that matters, because that is the only authentic version of the Christian religion. Now, all this came to a head in the year 1517, because in that year, a friar, that is to say, a traveling monk, I believe he was a Franciscan friar, he came and began to preach all over Germany. And he came ultimately to Wittenberg. And there he said, as he did elsewhere, he said that the Pope, by special arrangement, was offering people the means to salvation if they would buy what was called a papal indulgence. Their sins would be forgiven and they could advance their progress into heaven. All you needed to do was pay money. You had to pay money into this fund established by the Pope. Well, these were called indulgences. Well, based on Luther's learning and so on, he was absolutely outraged by this campaign for indulgences in return for money, signifying the financial corruption of the papacy. For him, and this is important, this is the root of his view of salvation. Basically, he said that the Catholic Church teaches that you have to take the 7 sacraments and do other good works in order to be saved. People commit sins, but they can be forgiven if they do good works. And they will ultimately reach salvation. Above all, they need to go to the priests who administer the sacraments. And the priest will forgive the sins and recognize their good works. And that's the way to achieve salvation. Luther said, no. Human beings are too sinful to earn by works their way to salvation. They're too damn sinful to do that. The only way that they can be saved is to believe in Jesus Christ. It's not man's works. It's Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, which basically saves humankind. So what Luther is all about is salvation through grace, the grace of God, the grace of Jesus. It's not about works. If you have faith in the saving message on the cross of Jesus, you will be saved. So it's faith rather than works which saves a person. Secondly, that's the first thing. Faith rather than works. Secondly, the priests, they themselves are sinful and they cannot mediate between God and man. There is no, if you have faith, you yourself are a priest. He said that there is a priesthood of all those who believe in Christ, what he called the priesthood of all believers. He undercut the whole priesthood, the whole Catholic priesthood, by this teaching. And finally, to come back to it, he said everything has to be based on the Bible or the gospel alone. Christianity is about the gospel. It's not about what the Pope says. It's not what about some theologian said. It's all about the Bible. Well, he began to openly preach these things in Wittenberg, and many of his treatises were quickly translated into German. And remember, the printed book was new. The printed pamphlet was new and affordable to not everybody, but to many people. And so Erasmus has already gained a wide audience, but Luther's teachings put into the German vernacular, literally tens and tens of thousands of these pamphlets were printed in Germany in the next few years. And Luther's teaching spread widely amongst the literate population, above all the middle class. Well, the authorities were scandalized. The authorities were horrified by what Luther was doing. And so in 1521, he was excommunicated by the Pope, and he was outlawed by Emperor Charles V. I've explained. Well, Luther would not back down. And indeed, he wrote a pamphlet which he addressed to the German authorities. He called it Address to the German Nobility. And he said basically this. He said, these Italians are stealing our money with their indulgences and all the other money they're collecting out of Germany. And they're promoting a false religion. And he created an enormous stir of German nationalism, early German nationalism as a result. And this huge movement that developed in Germany attracted the attention of the aristocrats, the princes, and the independent cities of Germany. Remember, Germany was divided up into a multitude of cities and principalities and so on, but they all became roused. And indeed, even in Scandinavia, people were reading these tracts, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway. And they all joined Luther's cause. And not only that, in Germany, the peasants were raised up. The peasants developed their own version. They went even further than Luther. They said, we want to elect our priests, our ministers. This is completely unheard of. We want to elect the people who lead the congregations. And as a matter of fact, why are we paying rent to the landlords? It turned into a peasants' war against the landlords. So it was a veritable revolutionary situation. Well, that movement was that popular movement was quashed. But the authorities, the political authorities, the princes, the cities, they all converted to the Luther's religion. Within a few years, this new religion, which we call Lutheranism, developed all over northern Germany and throughout Scandinavia. The princes organized new churches which basically revolted and rejected the authority of the Roman Church. And the princes now controlled these churches and also controlled the property, because remember, the church was such a hugely wealthy institution. Well, this was a veritable revolution that occurred, staged as or initiated by Luther. And soon there were other theologians who joined Luther and spread the Reformation beyond Germany itself. For example, in Switzerland, especially the German part, there was a character by the name of Zwingli, Ulrich Zwingli, who is the Swiss counterpart of Luther in Germany. In the in France and the French-speaking parts of the world, say the southern Netherlands, another theologian, John Calvin, in French, spread basically the same ideas. I'll have more to say about him later. And amongst the lower classes, you have the emergence of the Anabaptists, some of whom later, from 1570 onwards, became Mennonites. You're familiar with the Mennonites. They go back to the Anabaptists. And these people rejected baptism, infant baptism, I should say. And also, they refused to take oaths to government. They considered taking an oath to be loyal to a secular government to be unchristian. And so they rejected government. They were, in Europe, in fact, veritable anarchists. It was, you should understand, that Anabaptism started out as a revolutionary movement in Germany. Basically, this is what happened. It later became Pacific under the Mennonites, but early it was revolutionary in character. So basically what I'm saying that within a few years, most of Northern Europe seceded from the Roman Catholic Church, which had had a grip on Europe for 1,000 years. Suddenly this collapsed. And in England, we know that the king, Henry VIII, organized a similar secession, and that turned into a Protestant church, which we call Anglicanism. Well, all of this meant that if you take the animosity of the French and of the Ottomans, this secession of Northern Europe, this emergence of local churches all over Northern Europe, all over Germany, meant that Charles V basically had no chance of unifying Europe into a single empire. The political disunity was amplified by this religious disunity. Now, I want to focus on England because at this point, England becomes a focal point of many of these tendencies. And we should note that the development of Protestantism and the development of capitalism in England go hand in hand. There is a parallel. In fact, the Protestant Reformation, especially partly in its Lutheran form, but above all in the form of Calvin's teachings, Calvinism, is closely associated with the rise of capitalism. Now, capitalism began to develop. As a matter of fact, it was strongly developed in Germany at the time of the Reformation, 1517. Germany was actually in the avant-garde. It was the pioneer in the development of capitalism. But it developed most strongly and most significantly in England. And in particular, this is evident in the reign of this powerful English king, Henry VIII, who I remind you, his dates are 1509 to 1547. It was under Henry that capitalism began to develop strongly in England. And this is what I want to talk to you about for the next few moments, setting the stage for our discussion of Calvin. Now, during the reign of Henry VIII, first part of the 16th century, we can say, two things that happened that were very important, three things that happened that were very important to the development of capitalism. In the first place, England, which economically had been really a weak country up to this point, it mainly produced raw materials, which were exported to the more developed parts of Europe on the continent, especially the Netherlands. And in particular, one of the chief exports of the English during the Middle Ages had been raw wool. there were enormous numbers of sheep in England, and the wool was of the finest quality, best quality in Europe. But this wool was not manufactured into wool cloth, which was the basic cloth in England. That was done by the spinners and weavers of the Netherlands in what is now Holland and Belgium. So England just exported the raw wool. Well, essentially, Henry VIII set up protective tariffs, which prevented the export of raw wool. And in doing that, he stimulated the development of textile wool cloth manufacturing in England. And given the fact that this was the highest quality wool in Europe, this English wool textile became a huge bonanza for English entrepreneurs, English merchants, English capitalists, made huge money by producing this wool textile. It became one of the basic industries of England from the reign of Henry VIII himself, giving a great stimulus to the capitalist class. But even more important than the development of textile manufacturing was the development of capitalist agriculture. Because under Henry VIII, notably, what happened was that the richer peasants combined or in alliance with some landlords began to chase away the poor peasants, the peasants who produce food for their families, chase them off the land, enclose the land with fences, and basically turn it into private property. And they force the dispossessed peasants to basically become wage workers on their land. So the best land in southern England during the reign of Henry VIII basically was turned into capitalist land, private property, enclosed property, and worked by wage workers. This developed, it continued from then onwards, but there was a strong movement of this sort under Henry VIII. So we have the development parallel to capitalist manufacturing, we have capitalist agriculture developing in England. And finally, you have the Reformation in England. Now, Henry VIII started out as a Catholic. He's still not, the English monarchs are known as defenders of the faith, which is a title which was given to the English kings during the Middle Ages. But Henry VIII became increasingly dissatisfied with the church. And already by 1520, in parallel with the King of France and the Spanish king, the Pope was forced to concede that the English king politically controlled the English church in return for loyalty. However, toward the 10 years after the Reformation started in Germany, around in 1527, Henry VIII got into a dispute with the Pope. The Pope was Clement VII, over a divorce. He wanted a divorce. He didn't want to remain married to a woman by the name of Catherine of Aragon, because she could not produce an heir to the throne, a son, which would guarantee the continuation of the line of Henry VIII, the Tudor line in England. So Henry began a love affair with this woman, Anne Boleyn, and demanded that the popes allow the divorce. But as I explained earlier, Italy was now in the grip of Charles V. Catherine of Aragon was Charles V's aunt, related by blood, and Charles V insisted that the Pope could not grant such a divorce. Therefore, Henry VIII took things into his own hands. using the English Parliament as a legitimating device, he put through a series of laws, statutes, which basically separated the English church from the Roman church, and also set the king up as the head of the Church of England, which they still are. The English monarch is the head of the Anglican Church, and he took away 1/3 all of the lands of the monasteries. 1/3 of the real estate in England was owned by the monasteries. All of this land was confiscated by the king. It wasn't a question of Protestant teaching at this point. It was all about politics, power politics. And Henry VIII simply, by a political act, instituted the Reformation. Now, as Henry VIII's reign wore on, the Protestants began to get stronger because of what he did. And he made concessions to them. For example, he began to allow people to read the Bible and so on. But still, the basic teachings and practices of the English church were still essentially Catholic. It was only after his death, under the reign of his successor, his daughter, Elizabeth I, the Great, I'll call her king because she's so powerful, that England became the English church, the Anglican church became a Calvinist church. So I need to talk, so I've now dealt with the development of capitalism, and you will now see that the emergence of Calvinism is related. This is the third thing I really wanted to stress. Calvinism is basically a capitalist religion, is the way I would put it, to put it succinctly. Now, who was John Calvin? Actually, his name was Jean Calvin. He came from northern France. He was a Frenchman. He was educated as a lawyer, and he was living in Paris, practicing law, and he secretly converted to Protestantism. And what he hoped for initially was that the King of France, particularly because he was angry at Charles V, might break with Rome and the King of France might become a Protestant. No such thing happened. The King of France decided that he would do no such thing. He already controlled the church, and he didn't like the look of Protestantism. He thought it was subversive. So instead of converting to Catholicism, Francis I initiated a persecution of the Protestants in France. And so in 1532, Calvin was forced to flee from France into Switzerland. He wandered around for a while, and then in 1536, he found refuge in the town of Geneva, which, as you probably know, is right on the border between France and Switzerland. And with the help of his followers, he basically was able to seize control of the city of Geneva. Calvin, he seizes control, and he institutes what amounts to be a religious dictatorship over Geneva. And although not formally the ruler, his influence was so great that effectively he was ruling Geneva, and all of the members of his party listened to his word was gospel, so far as I was concerned. Well, he was a great organizer. Calvin was a lawyer. He had an acute religious sort of logical mind, and he used it to basically organize the Protestant religion. And in the first place, in 1536, he produced a comprehensive guide to the new Protestant faith. It's called the Christian Institutes, the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Basically, he explains in very rational terms the basic elements of the Protestant religion, which Luther did not do. So this becomes a kind of guidebook to what is and what is not the Protestant religion. The second thing he does, he institutes a new moral regime in Geneva, which we call Puritanism. Puritanism. So far as he was concerned, there was too much immorality. People were gambling, they were drinking, they were having extramarital sex, they were wearing colorful clothes, which God didn't like. And so he imposed a kind of sexual and sensual repression on people. He insisted on a very disciplined family life. Children and wives have to listen to their fathers, who's basically the religious as well as the head of the family. He's the religious head of the family. And people needed to work hard. Work discipline is essential. The family has to spend most of their time working, and if they're not working, they should be praying. And they should accumulate as much money as they can. Saving becomes one of the objects of this new morality, which we call Puritanism. Sexual and sensual repression, family discipline, work discipline, and accumulation of capital. That's why I said it's a capitalist-oriented religion. This is called the Protestant ethic, by the way. So the basic principles of Protestantism, the institution of Puritanism, and finally, Calvin was a great organizer. Now, we saw with Luther, and in the case of Henry VIII in England, the state came to control the church. All of the Lutheran churches were state churches. Obedience to the king amounted to you have to be obedient to the king's religion. Same thing in England. Under Henry VIII, the king's religion was your religion, and that was all there was to it. But Calvin said, no, church and state are separate. And indeed, religion is more important than politics. Ultimately, the politicians have to listen to the theologians. The theologians don't have to listen to the politicians. He separates the church and state. He makes the religion primary over politics. And he organizes a very tight organization. He gives the church control over the church over a disciplined elite of ministers and deacons come to control these Calvinist churches. Well, Calvinism had this, as a result of this, independent from the established political order, Calvinism took on a kind of subversive character. Princes, to say nothing of the Catholic Church, regarded the Calvinism as some sort of communism, as a kind of disciplined, organized, ideological movement that was bent on overthrowing established authority. And so Calvinism had this radical edge, which was going to play an important point. In any case, to conclude, Protestantism meant that what it basically did was to make it impossible for the Catholic establishment, but even the noble establishment, to basically control the rising middle class in Europe. And we'll see how this worked out in the next class.